Patricia Thompson sat across from her attorney, smoothing her perfectly pressed blazer as she delivered what she believed would be the final blow to my credibility. Your Honor, my son Alex has clearly suffered some kind of mental breakdown since his grandmother's passing. The erratic behavior, the paranoid accusations against his own family, the complete inability to manage basic financial responsibilities. We're deeply concerned about his capacity to handle a substantial inheritance or continue his role in our family business. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The courtroom was packed with extended family members, business associates, and what felt like half of Portland's legal community watching this spectacle unfold. I sat there in my simple navy suit, the one I wore to grandmother Eleanor's funeral 6 months earlier, feeling every bit the unstable, paranoid son my mother was describing to Judge Helen Martinez. My siblings Marcus and Rebecca nodded sadly from the gallery, playing their roles as concerned family members worried about their troubled brother's declining mental state. That's when Jordan Rivers, my partner of 2 years, stood up from the back of the courtroom and walked purposefully toward the front, carrying a sleek black briefcase that would shatter my family's carefully constructed lies forever. Because while my mother was spinning her tale of my supposed incompetence and mental instability, Jordan had spent 6 weeks methodically recording every private conversation, every scheming phone call, and every criminal conspiracy my family had orchestrated to steal my $2.3 million inheritance and destroy my life in the process. My family was about to learn that the quiet, trusting son they thought they could easily manipulate had been living with someone who specialized in uncovering exactly the kind of elaborate deception they had been planning. Jordan's briefcase contained 47 separate audio recordings that would expose not just their greed, but their willingness to commit fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to rob their own family member of everything our grandmother had worked a lifetime to build. The morning everything started falling apart began ordinarily enough, with what my mother called a simple family meeting to discuss grandmother Eleanor's estate. It was a crisp October morning in Portland, and I had driven from my Pearl District apartment to the family home in Forest Heights, the sprawling colonial where I had grown up believing my family was fundamentally decent and trustworthy. The maple trees lining the driveway were just beginning to turn their brilliant autumn colors, creating the kind of picturesque scene that belonged on a greeting card rather than serving as the backdrop for the most devastating betrayal of my life. I arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, as I always did for family gatherings, carrying a box of pastries from Powell's sweet shop that grandmother Eleanor had always loved. The house smelled like fresh coffee and my mother's signature cinnamon rolls, the same comforting combination that had welcomed me home countless times throughout my 35 years. Everything felt normal, familiar, safe. I had no reason to suspect that this gathering was anything other than another step in settling grandmother's affairs, the kind of necessary but tedious administrative work that follows the death of a beloved family matriarch. My father David was already seated at the dining room table, reading through what appeared to be legal documents, while occasionally glancing up to offer his characteristic gentle smile. At 65, he had the weathered look of someone who had spent 40 years managing other people's financial affairs, first as a CPA and later as co-owner of Thompson and Associates, the family accounting firm that had supported our comfortable middle-class lifestyle. He had always been the quiet one in our family, content to let my mother Patricia handle most decisions, while he focused on numbers and spreadsheets and the kind of methodical work that suited his reserved personality. Marcus shuffled in about 10 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept well and carrying the slightly desperate energy that had become his trademark since losing his marketing job 18 months earlier. At 38, my older brother had never quite found his professional footing, drifting between positions and increasingly relying on what he called short-term loans from family members to cover his expenses. I had written him 3 checks in the past year alone, totaling nearly $15,000, without asking too many questions about exactly why he needed the money or when he might be able to pay it back. Rebecca arrived last, as she often did, making an entrance that announced her importance and her busy schedule. At 33, she had built a successful career in marketing and always looked like she had stepped directly from a business magazine photo shoot. Her designer suit, perfectly styled hair, and confident stride into the room reminded everyone that she was the family success story, the one who had translated our middle-class values into genuine professional achievement. She kissed Mother's cheek, squeezed Father's shoulder, and gave me the kind of warm hug that made me feel grateful to be part of such a loving, close-knit family. Mother had prepared a full breakfast spread, which should have been my first clue that this meeting was more significant than the routine estate discussions she had described when she called to arrange it. There were fresh fruit salads, scrambled eggs, bacon, her famous cinnamon rolls, and the kind of elaborate presentation she usually reserved for holidays or special occasions. She moved around the dining room with the graceful efficiency of someone who had been hosting family gatherings for decades, making sure everyone had coffee, asking about our jobs and relationships, and creating the warm, inclusive atmosphere that had always made the Thompson family home feel like a sanctuary from the outside world. We talked about ordinary things while we ate. Rebecca shared updates about her latest marketing campaign for a local tech startup. Marcus mentioned that he was interviewing for a position with a nonprofit organization. Father discussed a complicated tax situation he was helping one of his longtime clients navigate. I talked about the software development project I was leading at my company, a comprehensive database system that was finally moving from testing into full implementation. Everything felt wonderfully normal, the kind of comfortable family interaction that I had always treasured and assumed would continue indefinitely. It wasn't until Mother cleared away the breakfast dishes and returned with a manila folder full of documents that the tone began to shift in ways I didn't immediately recognize as dangerous. She sat down with the measured seriousness of someone about to discuss important business, her real estate agent persona emerging as she organized papers and prepared to lead what was clearly a carefully planned presentation. Mother had always been the family organizer, the one who coordinated holidays and managed logistics and made sure everyone stayed connected despite busy schedules and diverging life paths. She opened the folder and spread several documents across the polished dining table, creating a formal workspace in the room where we had shared thousands of casual family meals. The papers included copies of grandmother Eleanor's will, financial statements from various bank accounts, property deeds, and what appeared to be preliminary estate tax calculations. Everything looked professional and legitimate, exactly the kind of documentation you would expect to see during the orderly settlement of a substantial estate. Grandmother Eleanor had been meticulous about her finances throughout her 91 years, accumulating wealth through careful investments, property ownership, and the kind of frugal living that had been shaped by her experience growing up during the Great Depression. She owned her house.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Outright, had substantial holdings in blue-chip stocks, maintained healthy balances in several bank accounts, and had inherited some valuable family jewelry that had been passed down through multiple generations. The total value of her estate was estimated at approximately $2.3 million, an amount that represented both her lifetime of careful financial management and our family's newfound financial security. According to the will that Mother read aloud, grandmother had divided her estate among her children and grandchildren in what appeared to be a fair and logical manner. The house would be sold, with proceeds divided equally among her 3 children, including my father. Various financial accounts would be distributed among family members based on their relationships with grandmother and their current financial situations. The jewelry would go to the women in the family, preserving the tradition of passing these pieces from mother to daughter across generations. What struck me as I listened to Mother's presentation was how thoroughly Grandmother had considered everyone's needs and circumstances in structuring her bequests. She had left larger amounts to family members who were struggling financially, including Marcus, while still ensuring that everyone received substantial inheritances that could genuinely improve their lives. She had been particularly generous to me, apparently because she believed my work in technology and my generally responsible approach to money meant I would use her gift wisely to build long-term financial security. My inheritance, according to the documents Mother showed us, would include approximately $800,000 from various financial accounts, plus a 40% ownership stake in Thompson & Associates, the family accounting firm that Father had built into a modestly successful practice, serving small businesses and individual clients throughout the Portland area. The business ownership was particularly meaningful because it represented both Grandmother's confidence in my abilities and her desire to keep the firm within the family as Father approached retirement. As Mother walked us through the various provisions and requirements, I felt overwhelmed by Grandmother's generosity and the responsibility that came with such a substantial inheritance. $800,000 represented more money than I had ever imagined possessing, enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house, and establish the kind of financial foundation that could support whatever personal and professional choices I wanted to make in the coming decades. The business ownership was equally significant, offering both immediate income potential and long-term financial security. But there were complications, Mother explained with the kind of concerned tone that suggested she was reluctantly sharing unpleasant but necessary information. The estate was more complex than Grandmother had anticipated when she drafted her will several years earlier. Tax implications were more severe than expected. Legal requirements for transferring business ownership were more complicated than the simple document transfers she had envisioned. Professional valuations were needed. Regulatory approvals were required. The entire process would take months to complete properly, and any mistakes could result in substantial penalties or legal challenges that could consume much of the estate's value. Mother had been working with several attorneys and financial advisors to navigate these complexities, she told us, and their unanimous recommendation was to establish a temporary family trust that could manage the estate during the lengthy legal and administrative process. This trust would be managed by family members who had demonstrated financial expertise and legal authority to make decisions on behalf of all beneficiaries. The goal was to protect everyone's interests while ensuring compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. The proposed trust structure seemed reasonable and even prudent as Mother described it. She and Father would serve as primary trustees, given their professional experience managing financial affairs and their intimate knowledge of Grandmother's intentions and values. Rebecca would serve as a secondary trustee, contributing her business experience and ensuring younger generation representation in important decisions. Marcus and I would be beneficiaries with input into major decisions, but without the legal responsibilities and potential personal liability that came with formal trustee roles. All estate assets would be transferred into the trust immediately, Mother explained, protecting them from potential legal challenges and ensuring professional management during the complex settlement process. Individual distributions would be made according to Grandmother's wishes, but only after all legal requirements had been satisfied and proper valuations had been completed. This approach would ultimately result in larger inheritances for everyone, since professional management would maximize asset values and minimize tax obligations. The trust documents were thick and filled with legal language that was difficult to understand without professional training, but Mother assured us that everything had been reviewed by qualified attorneys who specialized in estate planning and tax law. She had copies for everyone to review, though she emphasized that time was critical because certain legal deadlines were approaching rapidly. The sooner we could all sign the necessary documents, the sooner the trust could be established, and the estate settlement process could begin in earnest. I remember feeling simultaneously grateful for Mother's careful attention to these complex matters, and slightly overwhelmed by the legal and financial intricacies she was describing. Estate settlement had always seemed like something that happened to other families, not something I would need to understand personally. The trust structure made sense intellectually, and I appreciated having family members with relevant expertise handle the complicated legal and administrative work while I focused on my job and my relationship with Jordan. Marcus seemed equally relieved to have mother and father managing the process, admitting that he had been worried about his ability to handle complex financial decisions during what was already an emotionally difficult period following grandmother's death. Rebecca asked several detailed questions about timelines and legal requirements, but seemed satisfied with mother's explanations and the professional advice she had received. Father nodded approvingly throughout the presentation, occasionally adding technical details about tax implications and business valuation requirements. By the end of the meeting, we had all agreed to sign the trust documents and move forward with Mother's recommended approach to estate settlement. The decision felt responsible and collaborative, exactly the kind of family cooperation that grandmother would have wanted during this difficult transition. I left the house feeling grateful for my family's support and optimistic about the financial security that grandmother's generosity would provide. It would be 2 weeks before I began to understand that the entire meeting had been an elaborate performance designed to manipulate me into signing away my inheritance rights. The trust documents I had signed so trustingly were not protecting my interests, but rather transferring all my assets into accounts controlled exclusively by my mother and siblings. The legal complexities and tax implications that had seemed so daunting were largely fictional, created to justify a structure that would allow them to steal grandmother's estate while maintaining the appearance of legitimate family financial planning. The first hint that something was seriously wrong came during a casual conversation with Jordan, 3 weeks after the family meeting. We were having dinner at our favorite restaurant in the Pearl District, a cozy Italian place where we had celebrated our second anniversary just a month earlier. Jordan was telling me about a new client whose business partner had been embezzling money through an elaborate scheme involving false invoices and shell companies. When something about the story triggered an uncomfortable recognition, Jordan worked as a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud and insurance investigations, with a particular expertise in financial crimes and digital forensics. Most of their cases involved routine insurance claims or background checks for employment purposes, but occasionally they uncovered sophisticated fraud schemes that required law enforcement involvement. They had developed an intuitive sense for the kinds of patterns and inconsistencies that typically indicated deliberate deception rather than honest mistakes or oversights. As I described the family trust and the estate settlement process, Jordan began asking questions that revealed details I hadn't considered significant when they occurred. Why had mother insisted on such urgency in signing documents that supposedly protected against legal deadlines that were never clearly explained? Why were the trust terms so heavily weighted toward trustee discretion rather than specific distribution requirements? Why hadn't anyone suggested that I review the documents with an independent attorney before signing them? Jordan's questions weren't accusatory or suspicious in tone, but rather reflected the same analytical approach they brought to their professional investigations. They were trained to look for inconsistencies and verify information before accepting explanations at face value. Their questions made me realize that I had been so focused on trusting my family and relieved to have their expertise managing complex legal matters that I hadn't applied the same critical thinking I would use for any other significant financial decision. That night, I called Lisa Park, an attorney who had helped me with the purchase of my condo 2 years earlier. I explained that I wanted to review the estate documents to better understand my rights and responsibilities as a trust beneficiary. Lisa agreed to meet with me the following week to go through everything in detail and answer any questions I might have about the legal structure my family had established. Lisa's review of the trust documents revealed language and provisions that were far more concerning than anything Jordan's questions had suggested. The trust was structured to give trustees nearly unlimited discretion over asset management and distribution timing. Beneficiaries had virtually no rights to demand information about trust activities or challenge trustee decisions. Most troubling, the trust included provisions that would allow trustees to determine that beneficiaries were incompetent to receive distributions, with that determination made entirely at trustee discretion, without any requirement for medical or legal evaluation. According to Lisa's analysis, the trust documents I had signed essentially gave my mother and siblings complete control over my inheritance, with no meaningful legal protections for my interests and no realistic mechanism for challenging their decisions if they chose to act against my wishes. The language about protecting assets during estate settlement was technically accurate but practically meaningless, since the trust structure provided no guarantees that assets would ever be distributed according to grandmother's original intentions. Lisa recommended that I immediately request detailed financial statements from the trustees showing all trust assets and activities since establishment. She also suggested that I hire an independent accountant to review the estate valuation and verify that all of grandmother's assets had been properly transferred into the trust. These steps would help determine whether the trust was being managed appropriately or whether there were signs of mismanagement or deliberate misconduct. When I called Mother to request financial statements and asset documentation, her response was immediate and revealing. She seemed surprised and hurt that I would question the family's management of grandmother's estate, reminding me that she and father had decades of experience handling financial matters and had already invested substantial time and money in professional legal and accounting advice. She suggested that my questions reflected a troubling lack of trust in family members who were working hard to protect everyone's interests. Mother's tone shifted from hurt to concerned as she suggested that my sudden suspicion and demands for documentation might indicate stress or emotional instability related to grandmother's death and the major life changes that were occurring as a result of my inheritance. She wondered aloud whether I might benefit from counseling to help process the grief and anxiety that were apparently causing me to question family members who had always supported and protected me. Rebecca called me that evening with similar concerns about my emotional state and my relationship with Jordan, suggesting that my partner might be encouraging paranoid thinking about family financial matters. She pointed out that Jordan was not a family member and couldn't possibly understand the love and trust that had always characterized Thompson family relationships. She worried that outside influences were causing me to doubt people who had proven their dedication to my well-being throughout my entire life. Marcus visited my apartment the next day with what he described as a brotherly concern about changes in my personality and judgment since grandmother's death. He suggested that I was becoming paranoid and suspicious in ways that were damaging my relationships with people who cared about me. He offered to help me find a counselor who could provide professional support during what was obviously a difficult emotional period. The coordinated nature of these expressions of concern should have been an immediate red flag, but instead I found myself questioning my own perceptions and wondering whether grief and stress were indeed affecting my judgment more than I realized. My family's unified message that I was becoming unstable and paranoid was delivered with such apparent love and worry that it seemed more credible than my growing suspicions about their motives and behavior. It was Jordan who suggested that we install a small recording device in my car before my next family meeting, not because they suspected criminal activity, but because they wanted to help me understand whether my family's private conversations matched their public expressions of concern about my mental state. The device was professional-grade equipment that Jordan used routinely in their investigation work, capable of capturing clear audio, even in challenging environments. That recording would be the first of many that would eventually expose the full scope of my family's conspiracy and provide the evidence needed to protect my inheritance and my reputation from their elaborate scheme to steal everything grandmother had left me. The first recording Jordan and I captured was during what Mother had described as a routine family dinner the following Sunday. The device, no larger than a matchbox, was discreetly attached under the dashboard of my Honda Civic, positioned to capture conversations from anyone sitting in the vehicle. Jordan had tested it thoroughly to ensure the audio quality would be sufficient for legal purposes, though at the time I still hoped we would discover nothing more troubling than ordinary family concerns about my emotional well-being. I arrived at the Forest Heights house, carrying flowers from the farmer's market and a bottle of wine, maintaining the same cheerful demeanor I had brought to family gatherings throughout my adult life. The October afternoon was crisp and beautiful, with golden sunlight filtering through the maple trees that lined our quiet residential street. Neighbors were raking leaves and preparing their gardens for winter, creating the kind of peaceful suburban scene that had always made me feel fortunate to have grown up in such a stable, loving environment. Mother greeted me at the front door with her usual warm hug and immediately began discussing the menu she had planned for our dinner. She had prepared pot roast with vegetables, one of my childhood favorites, along with fresh bread and apple pie made from fruit she had picked at a local orchard the previous weekend. The house smelled wonderful, filled with the rich aromas of slow-cooked comfort food and the cinnamon-scented candles she always lit for special occasions. Father was in the living room reading the Sunday paper and listening to classical music, a ritual he had maintained for as long as I could remember. He looked up with genuine pleasure when I entered, setting aside his reading to ask about my work and my relationship with Jordan. His questions were thoughtful and engaged, reflecting the kind of paternal interest that had always made me feel valued and supported. We talked about the database project I was managing and the challenges of coordinating multiple development teams across different time zones. Marcus arrived shortly after I did, looking more rested and optimistic than he had in recent months. He mentioned that the nonprofit interview had gone well and that he was hopeful about receiving a job offer within the next week. His mood seemed genuinely improved, and he thanked me again for the financial support I had provided during his unemployment period. He promised to begin repaying those loans as soon as he was working again, though I assured him there was no pressure about timing. Rebecca joined us about an hour later, apologizing for her tardiness and explaining that she had been dealing with a client crisis that required immediate attention. She looked polished and professional, even on a Sunday afternoon, wearing casual clothes that somehow managed to convey both relaxation and sophistication. She hugged everyone warmly and immediately began helping Mother with final dinner preparations, moving through the kitchen with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. Dinner conversation was pleasant and wide-ranging, covering topics from local politics to family memories to plans for the upcoming holiday season. Rebecca shared amusing stories about her marketing clients, including a local restaurant owner who insisted on personally approving every social media post before publication. Marcus talked enthusiastically about the nonprofit's mission and his excitement about potentially joining their development team. Father discussed a complex tax situation involving one of his longtime clients, while Mother described her recent success helping a young couple purchase their first home. Everything felt wonderfully normal and familiar, exactly the kind of comfortable family interaction that had sustained our close relationships, despite busy schedules and different life paths. We laughed together, shared memories, and made plans for future gatherings with the easy intimacy of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I felt grateful for my family's continued support and optimistic about how Jordan would fit into these cherished traditions once our relationship became more serious. It wasn't until Mother suggested that Marcus and I take a drive to see the autumn foliage while she and Rebecca cleaned up that the evening took on a different character. Marcus seemed enthusiastic about the idea, mentioning several scenic routes through the Columbia River Gorge that would showcase the season's spectacular colors. Father opted to stay home and continue reading, while Mother and Rebecca insisted they could handle the kitchen cleanup without assistance. Marcus and I climbed into my car and headed toward the scenic highway that followed the Columbia River east of Portland. The late afternoon light was perfect for viewing the fall colors, and the drive initially felt like a pleasant extension of our family dinner. Marcus seemed relaxed and talkative, sharing updates about his job search and his tentative plans for rebuilding his career in nonprofit development. His conversation was engaging and optimistic, reflecting a hopefulness I hadn't seen in him for many months. About 20 minutes into our drive, as we were admiring a particularly spectacular grove of maple trees, Marcus's tone shifted in a way that immediately caught my attention. He began talking about the stress I had been experiencing since grandmother's death, suggesting that grief could manifest in unexpected ways that might not be immediately obvious to the person experiencing them. His voice carried a note of concern that seemed genuine, but there was also something rehearsed about his words that made me wonder whether this conversation had been planned rather than spontaneous. Marcus talked about his own experience with emotional instability during difficult periods, particularly following his divorce 3 years earlier, and again during his recent unemployment. He described how stress and anxiety had sometimes caused him to become suspicious and paranoid about people who were trying to help him, leading to damaged relationships and poor decisions that he later regretted. His tone was understanding and supportive, but there was an underlying message that my recent questions about the estate trust might reflect similar psychological challenges. He suggested that my relationship with Jordan might be contributing to these problems, not because Jordan was intentionally harmful, but because outsiders often couldn't understand the complex dynamics of close family relationships. Marcus worried that Jordan might be encouraging me to question family members who had always acted in my best interests, creating unnecessary conflict and suspicion where none should exist. He emphasized that Jordan's professional background in investigation might predispose them to look for problems even in innocent situations. As Marcus continued talking, I began to understand that this conversation was not a casual brotherly concern, but rather a carefully planned intervention designed to undermine my trust in Jordan and discourage my questions about the estate management. His words were delivered with apparent love and worry, but the underlying message was clear. I was becoming mentally unstable, Jordan was a negative influence, and my family's handling of grandmother's estate should not be questioned or investigated. The recording device captured every word of Marcus's manipulation, including his suggestion that I might benefit from professional counseling to address what he described as growing paranoia and trust issues. He offered to help me find a therapist who could provide objective guidance about family relationships and inheritance matters. He also suggested that I might want to limit my discussions about estate issues with Jordan, since outside perspectives could complicate family dynamics and create unnecessary tension. By the time we returned to the house, I understood that my family's expressions of concern about my mental state were not random reactions to my behavior, but rather coordinated elements of a strategy designed to discredit my questions about their management of grandmother's estate. The timing and consistency of their concerns, combined with Marcus's carefully rehearsed talking points during our private drive, revealed a level of planning and coordination that contradicted their claims to be acting in my best interests. When I shared the recording with Jordan later that evening, their professional analysis confirmed my growing suspicions about my family's motives and behavior. Jordan pointed out specific phrases and arguments that suggested Marcus was following a script rather than expressing spontaneous concerns. The psychological manipulation techniques he had used were sophisticated and deliberate, designed to make me question my own perceptions while discouraging independent investigation of the estate management. Jordan recommended that we gather more recordings before taking any direct action, since a single conversation might not provide sufficient evidence of a broader conspiracy. They suggested that we document additional family interactions to establish patterns of coordination and manipulation that would be difficult for my family to explain or dismiss. The goal was to build a comprehensive record of their activities that could be used to protect my interests and recover any assets that might have been misappropriated. Over the following 2 weeks, Jordan and I captured several more recordings using various devices and techniques. Jordan's professional equipment included miniature recording devices that could be concealed in clothing, vehicles, or personal items, along with sophisticated listening equipment that could capture conversations from considerable distances. Their expertise in surveillance technology allowed us to document my family's private conversations without detection, building a detailed record of their coordination and planning. The most revealing recording occurred during a family meeting at my parents' house that I was not invited to attend. Jordan had positioned a listening device near the dining room window the previous evening, taking advantage of their professional skills and equipment to monitor the conversation from a nearby location. The audio quality was excellent, capturing clear recordings of a 90-minute discussion that exposed the full scope of my family's conspiracy and their specific plans for stealing my inheritance. Mother began the meeting by expressing frustration about my recent questions regarding estate documentation and financial statements. She complained that my demands for information were becoming more persistent and specific, suggesting that Jordan was teaching me to ask the kinds of questions that could expose their activities. Her tone was angry rather than concerned, revealing that her previous expressions of worry about my mental state had been calculated performances rather than genuine emotions. Rebecca reported on her research into legal strategies for having me declared mentally incompetent to manage substantial financial assets. She had consulted with several attorneys about the process for obtaining court-ordered psychological evaluations and the criteria that judges typically used when determining capacity issues. Her investigation had revealed that mental incompetence determinations were relatively rare and difficult to obtain unless there was clear evidence of severe psychological impairment or cognitive decline. Marcus provided updates on his efforts to create evidence of my supposed mental instability, including documentation of erratic behavior and poor judgment that could support an incompetence petition. He had been keeping detailed notes about my conversations and behavior, focusing on any statements or actions that could be interpreted as paranoid, irrational, or inconsistent with normal decision-making processes. His goal was to build a case file that could convince a judge that I was incapable of managing my inheritance responsibly. Father's contributions to the discussion were more reluctant but equally revealing. He expressed discomfort with the deception involved in their scheme but acknowledged that the family's financial situation required aggressive action to secure grandmother's estate assets. He had used his professional expertise to establish financial accounts that would be difficult to trace, ensuring that estate assets could be moved and managed without creating obvious evidence of misappropriation. The recording captured detailed discussions about forged documents, manipulated financial records, and coordinated false testimony that would be used to support their claims about my mental incompetence and their right to control the estate assets. They discussed specific lies they would tell in court proceedings, including fabricated examples of my erratic behavior and invented consultations with mental health professionals who had supposedly expressed concerns about my psychological stability. Most damaging was their casual discussion of grandmother's actual intentions and their complete disregard for her wishes regarding estate distribution. They acknowledged that grandmother had specifically intended for me to receive substantial assets and business ownership, but they justified their theft by claiming that I was not mature or responsible enough to handle such significant wealth. Their conversation revealed that they had planned this scheme for months, beginning shortly after grandmother's diagnosis of the illness that would eventually lead to her death. The recording also captured their discussion of contingency plans if their initial strategy failed to secure control of the estate assets. They had researched the possibility of challenging grandmother's will on grounds of diminished capacity, claiming that she had been mentally impaired when she made the bequest decisions that favored me over other family members. They had also considered the possibility of claiming that I had exercised undue influence over grandmother during her final years, manipulating her into changing her estate planning to benefit me at the expense of other family members. When Jordan and I reviewed this recording together, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear for the first time. My family was not simply mismanaging estate assets or making poor decisions about trust administration. They were engaged in a coordinated criminal enterprise involving fraud, forgery, perjury, and conspiracy to steal my inheritance through false legal proceedings and fabricated evidence of mental incompetence. Jordan's professional analysis of the recordings revealed multiple felony violations that could result in substantial prison sentences for all participants in the conspiracy. The evidence was clear and comprehensive, providing prosecutors with detailed documentation of criminal planning and coordination that would be extremely difficult to defend against in court. The recordings also provided strong civil evidence that could be used to recover stolen assets and obtain damages for the emotional and financial harm caused by their actions. Armed with this evidence, Jordan and I began developing a strategy for exposing the conspiracy and protecting my interests without alerting my family to our knowledge of their activities. The goal was to allow them to proceed with their scheme far enough to establish clear evidence of criminal conduct, while preventing them from causing irreversible damage to the estate assets or my reputation. This required careful timing and coordination with law enforcement and legal professionals who could ensure that justice was served while maximizing the recovery of stolen assets. Lisa Park, the attorney who had initially reviewed the trust documents, agreed to represent me in both criminal and civil proceedings against my family. Her analysis of the recorded evidence confirmed that we had documentation of multiple serious crimes that would almost certainly result in successful prosecutions. She also believed that the civil case for recovering stolen assets would be straightforward, since the recordings provided clear evidence of their intent to defraud and their acknowledgement that the estate assets rightfully belonged to me. The most challenging aspect of our situation was the emotional devastation of discovering that people I had loved and trusted throughout my life were willing to destroy my reputation and steal my inheritance for their own financial benefit. The recordings had revealed not just criminal behavior but also their complete lack of regard for my well-being or the family relationships that I had always treasured. Their casual discussions of fabricating evidence and lying in court proceedings showed a level of callous calculation that was difficult to reconcile with the loving family members I thought I knew. Jordan provided both professional expertise and personal support during this difficult period, helping me understand that my family's betrayal was not a reflection of my judgment or character, but rather evidence of their willingness to prioritize money over relationships and honesty. Their professional experience with fraud investigations had taught them that family-based financial crimes were often the most devastating because they combined material theft with the destruction of trust and emotional security that victims had relied upon throughout their lives. As we prepared for the legal confrontation that would expose my family's crimes and recover my stolen inheritance, I struggled with feelings of grief and anger that were unlike anything I had experienced during grandmother's death or any other personal loss. The people who had raised me and taught me about honesty and family loyalty had revealed themselves to be capable of elaborate deception and criminal behavior directed specifically at destroying my life for their financial benefit. But Jordan's support and Lisa's professional guidance helped me understand that exposing their crimes was not just about recovering stolen assets but also about preventing them from victimizing other people and holding them accountable for their choices. The recordings we had gathered provided clear evidence of criminal behavior that could not be ignored or excused, regardless of family relationships or emotional complications. The stage was set for a legal confrontation that would shock my extended family and the Portland business community while providing justice for grandmother's memory and protection for the inheritance she had worked a lifetime to accumulate. My family's conspiracy was about to be exposed in the most public and devastating way possible, with consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate financial implications of their theft. The foundation of my family's conspiracy actually traced back to my grandmother Eleanor's final years, when her declining health had made it increasingly clear that her substantial estate would soon be distributed among family members. What I discovered through Jordan's investigation was that my mother had begun planning this theft almost immediately after grandmother's cancer diagnosis, recognizing that grandmother's generosity toward me represented both an opportunity and a threat to her own financial security. The recordings revealed that mother had spent months studying grandmother's financial affairs, using her real estate expertise and father's accounting knowledge to develop a comprehensive understanding of the estate's value and complexity. They had identified specific assets that could be easily transferred or liquidated, along with others that would require more sophisticated manipulation to control. Their planning had been methodical and patient, taking advantage of grandmother's trust and her declining ability to monitor her own affairs during her final illness. What made their scheme particularly insidious was how they had used my genuine grief and confusion following grandmother's death to manipulate me into signing documents that I believed were protecting my interests but were actually transferring control of my inheritance to them. The trust structure they had created was legally valid but designed to serve their purposes rather than mine, giving them broad discretionary power while providing me with no meaningful protections or recourse. Mother had researched the psychological techniques needed to make me question my own perceptions and judgment, studying articles about gaslighting and emotional manipulation that would help her convince me that my suspicions were signs of mental instability rather than reasonable responses to their suspicious behavior. She had coordinated with Marcus and Rebecca to ensure that their expressions of concern would seem spontaneous and genuine rather than rehearsed and calculated. The recordings from their private meetings revealed casual discussions about my personality and psychology that were both clinical and contemptuous. They analyzed my trusting nature and my desire to maintain family harmony as weaknesses that could be exploited to prevent me from taking decisive action to protect my interests. They discussed my relationship with Jordan as a potential threat that needed to be undermined through careful manipulation of my emotions and insecurities. Father's role in the conspiracy was perhaps the most painful to discover since I had always viewed him as fundamentally honest and decent despite his tendency to defer to Mother's stronger personality. The recordings revealed that while he was uncomfortable with the deception involved in their scheme, he was also the architect of the financial structures that made their theft possible. His professional expertise in accounting and tax law had been essential for creating the complex web of trusts and accounts that would allow them to steal and hide grandmother's assets. His discomfort with their criminal activities was genuine but ultimately irrelevant to his actions. He had expressed moral reservations about lying to me and forging documents, but he had also provided the technical expertise needed to make their scheme effective. His ethical concerns were secondary to his financial interests and his unwillingness to challenge Mother's leadership of their conspiracy. Rebecca's contributions to the conspiracy demonstrated a level of strategic thinking and attention to detail that I had always admired in her professional life but found horrifying when directed against me. She had researched legal precedents for mental incompetence determinations, identifying specific criteria that judges used when evaluating capacity issues and developing strategies for creating false evidence that would meet those standards. Her analysis of successful incompetence cases had revealed that family testimony was often crucial in convincing courts that individuals were incapable of managing substantial assets. She had prepared detailed scripts for family members to follow when testifying about my supposed mental instability, ensuring that their statements would be consistent and credible. Her marketing background had taught her how to craft persuasive narratives that could influence decision-makers, skills that she was now applying to destroying my reputation and stealing my inheritance. Marcus's role was more tactical than strategic, focused on creating and documenting evidence of my alleged mental instability through careful observation and deliberate provocation. The recordings revealed that he had been instructed to engage me in conversations that could be misinterpreted as signs of paranoia or irrationality while documenting my responses in ways that would support their claims about my psychological deterioration. His apparent improvement in mood and optimism during recent family gatherings had been a performance designed to make him seem like a reliable witness whose concerns about my mental state would carry credibility with judges and mental health professionals. His expressions of gratitude for my financial support were calculated to establish his credibility as someone who cared about my well-being and had no financial motive for making false claims about my competence. The scope of their planning extended far beyond simple theft of estate assets. They had prepared comprehensive strategies for dealing with potential legal challenges, including plans for destroying or hiding evidence if their activities were discovered. They had researched the statute of limitations for various financial crimes, calculating how long they would need to maintain their deception before the risk of criminal prosecution would diminish significantly. Their contingency planning included strategies for discrediting Jordan if my partner became too persistent in investigating their activities. They had researched Jordan's professional background and personal history, looking for information that could be used to undermine their credibility as a witness or investigator. They had also prepared explanations for why Jordan might have personal or financial motives for encouraging me to question family members who were acting in my best interests. The recordings captured detailed discussions about specific lies they would tell in court proceedings, including fabricated consultations with mental health professionals and invented examples of my erratic behavior. They had prepared documentation that appeared to support their claims, including falsified medical records and manipulated financial statements that would make their version of events seem credible to judges and attorneys who had no independent knowledge of the actual circumstances. Their plan for the court proceedings was sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to present a consistent narrative that would be difficult to challenge without extensive investigation. They had anticipated potential questions and prepared responses that would reinforce their credibility while undermining mine. Their strategy relied heavily on the assumption that family testimony would be given greater weight than the protests of someone they were claiming was mentally unstable. What the recordings revealed most clearly was their complete disregard for grandmother's actual intentions and their cynical manipulation of her memory to justify their theft. They acknowledged privately that grandmother had specifically intended for me to receive substantial assets and business ownership, but they rationalized their actions by claiming that she had been naive about my ability to handle such responsibilities. Their version of grandmother's wishes conveniently aligned with their financial interests rather than her documented estate planning decisions. Their discussions about grandmother's mental state during her final years were particularly disturbing, as they had prepared false claims about her cognitive decline that could be used to challenge the validity of her will if other strategies failed. They were willing to dishonor her memory and question her competence in order to steal the assets she had worked a lifetime to accumulate for her family's benefit. Jordan's professional analysis of these recordings identified multiple felony violations that demonstrated the criminal nature of their conspiracy beyond any reasonable doubt. The evidence included clear documentation of fraud, forgery, perjury, conspiracy, and elder abuse, along with detailed planning for additional crimes that had not yet been committed. The recordings provided prosecutors with the kind of comprehensive evidence that made successful prosecution virtually certain. The civil implications were equally clear, as the recordings documented their acknowledgement that the estate assets rightfully belonged to me and their deliberate decision to steal those assets through deception and legal manipulation. Their own words provided irrefutable evidence of their intent to defraud, eliminating any possibility that their actions could be characterized as good faith mistakes or misunderstandings about estate administration. Lisa Park's review of the recorded evidence confirmed that we had documentation sufficient to support both criminal charges and civil recovery actions that would not only restore my inheritance but also provide substantial additional damages for the emotional and reputational harm they had attempted to cause. The strength of our evidence meant that any competent attorney would advise my family to accept responsibility and negotiate settlement terms rather than risk the severe consequences of criminal conviction and civil liability. The challenge we faced was timing the revelation of our evidence to maximize its impact while minimizing the damage my family could cause if they realized their activities had been discovered. Jordan's experience with complex fraud investigations had taught them that premature disclosure could allow criminals to destroy evidence, transfer assets beyond recovery, or flee jurisdiction before criminal charges could be filed. Our strategy required careful coordination with law enforcement and the court system to ensure that criminal charges would be filed simultaneously with our civil action, preventing my family from using the time between discovery and prosecution to cause additional harm. Jordan had developed relationships with prosecutors and investigators who specialized in financial crimes, providing us with professional guidance about the most effective approaches for ensuring justice and recovery. The emotional challenge of preparing to destroy my family's lives was more difficult than any legal or financial consideration. Despite their betrayal and criminal behavior, these were people who had raised me and taught me fundamental values about honesty and family loyalty. The recordings had revealed that they were willing to abandon those values when their financial interests were at stake, but they had also shown genuine love and concern for me in other contexts throughout my life. Jordan helped me understand that exposing their crimes was not an act of revenge but rather a necessary step for protecting myself and preventing them from victimizing other people in the future. Their willingness to engage in elaborate deception and criminal behavior suggested that they would continue these activities if they were not held accountable for their actions. The recordings had revealed discussions about potential future targets, including other family members and business clients who might be vulnerable to similar schemes. The professional counseling that Jordan arranged helped me process the complex emotions associated with discovering that my family was engaged in systematic criminal behavior directed against me. The therapist specialized in family trauma and financial abuse, providing both practical guidance about legal proceedings and emotional support for dealing with the betrayal and loss that accompanied the destruction of relationships I had treasured throughout my life. As we prepared for the legal confrontation that would expose their conspiracy and recover my stolen inheritance, I struggled with the knowledge that my actions would likely result in prison sentences for people I had loved and trusted. The recordings provided clear evidence of serious crimes that prosecutors would be obligated to pursue aggressively, regardless of family relationships or emotional complications. But the alternative was to allow them to continue their theft and deception, potentially destroying my financial security and reputation while encouraging them to believe that their criminal behavior could continue without consequences. The recordings had revealed that they viewed my trusting nature as a permanent weakness that would prevent me from taking decisive action to protect myself, even when presented with clear evidence of their betrayal. The scope of their criminal activity extended beyond my immediate situation, as the recordings had captured discussions about using similar techniques against other potential targets. Father's accounting practice provided access to elderly clients
who might be vulnerable to financial manipulation, while Mother's real estate business offered opportunities to exploit buyers and sellers who trusted her professional expertise. Their success in stealing my inheritance would likely encourage them to pursue additional criminal enterprises that could harm many other victims. Jordan's investigation had also revealed evidence of previous suspicious activities that suggested this was not their first attempt at financial fraud. Their coordination and sophistication indicated experience with deception and manipulation that had probably been developed through earlier criminal activities that had not been detected or reported. The pattern of behavior documented in our recordings suggested a criminal enterprise rather than an isolated incident motivated by specific financial pressures. The decision to expose their conspiracy was ultimately about justice rather than revenge, though the emotional satisfaction of proving my competence and their criminality was undeniably powerful. They had invested months in carefully planned attacks on my reputation and mental health, confident that their superior planning and family relationships would protect them from any consequences. The recordings we had gathered would demonstrate that their confidence had been misplaced, and their planning had been inadequate to account for the possibility that their victim might be more resourceful than they had anticipated. The stage was set for a legal confrontation that would shock everyone who knew our family and expose the criminal behavior that had been hidden behind facades of love and concern. The recordings Jordan and I had gathered provided comprehensive documentation of their conspiracy, ensuring that justice would be served and my inheritance would be recovered despite their elaborate attempts at theft and deception. The morning of the court hearing arrived with an unseasonable warmth for November in Portland, as if nature itself was conspiring to create the perfect dramatic backdrop for the revelation that would destroy my family's carefully constructed lies. Jordan and I had spent the previous evening conducting final reviews of our evidence, ensuring that every recording was properly labeled and every document was organized for maximum impact during the proceedings. The weight of what we were about to unleash felt both terrifying and liberating, knowing that within hours the truth would finally emerge after months of deception and manipulation. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit that projected competence and stability, the exact opposite of the mentally unstable persona my family had been crafting for the court's consideration. Jordan wore their professional attire, the same type of outfit they wore when testifying as an expert witness in complex fraud cases, understanding that their credibility would be crucial for establishing the authenticity and significance of the recordings we were about to present. The Multnomah County Courthouse was busier than I had expected, filled with attorneys, court personnel, and families dealing with their own legal crises. The marble floors and high ceilings created an atmosphere of formal gravity that seemed appropriate for the dramatic confrontation that was about to unfold. Jordan and I met with Lisa Park in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, conducting our final preparation and reviewing the strategic timing of our evidence presentation. Lisa had coordinated with the district attorney's office to ensure that criminal investigators would be present in the courtroom, ready to take immediate action once the recordings were played and the scope of my family's criminal conspiracy became clear. The plan was to allow my family to present their case first, giving them enough rope to hang themselves with additional lies and false testimony before we revealed the evidence that would expose their entire scheme. When we entered the courtroom, I was struck by how many people had come to witness what they expected would be a routine competency hearing. Extended family members, family friends, business associates, and curious observers filled the gallery, all anticipating what Mother had described as unfortunate but necessary proceedings to protect an unstable family member from his own poor judgment. Their presence would make the eventual revelation even more devastating for my family's reputation and social standing. My family was already seated at the petitioner's table, dressed in conservative business attire that projected respectability and concern. Mother wore a navy blue suit with minimal jewelry, creating an image of maternal responsibility and financial conservatism. Father sat beside her in his best suit, looking uncomfortable but determined to support the narrative they had constructed. Marcus and Rebecca were positioned nearby, ready to provide testimony about my supposed mental deterioration and their concerns about my ability to manage substantial assets. Their attorney, Robert Chen, from one of Portland's most prestigious family law firms, looked confident and well prepared as he organized his files and conferred quietly with his clients. He had obviously been given a carefully edited version of events that portrayed my family as reluctant but responsible relatives forced to seek court intervention to protect someone they loved from his own psychological instability. The thickness of his case file suggested that my family had provided extensive documentation to support their claims about my incompetence. Judge Helen Martinez entered the courtroom precisely at 9 o'clock, bringing an immediate sense of authority and formality to the proceedings. At 58, she had a reputation for thorough analysis and fair decisions in complex family law cases, along with particular expertise in competency determinations and estate disputes. Her presence commanded respect from everyone in the courtroom, including the numerous observers who had come expecting to witness a straightforward legal proceeding. Robert Chen's opening statement was masterfully crafted, presenting my family as loving relatives who had reluctantly concluded that court intervention was necessary to protect my welfare and preserve the estate assets that grandmother had intended to benefit our entire family. He described my recent behavior as increasingly erratic and paranoid, characterized by unfounded accusations against family members who had always acted in my best interests and supported my welfare throughout my life. According to Chen's narrative, my suspicions about the estate trust were symptoms of psychological deterioration triggered by grief over grandmother's death and exacerbated by my relationship with Jordan, whose professional background in investigation had encouraged me to view normal family financial management as evidence of criminal conspiracy. He presented my demands for documentation and financial statements as examples of paranoid thinking that demonstrated my inability to distinguish between reasonable oversight and irrational suspicion. Chen called Mother as his first witness, and her testimony was a masterpiece of calculated emotion and apparent maternal concern. She described my childhood and adolescence as normal and happy, emphasizing my close relationships with family members and my previous trust in their judgment and guidance. Her voice carried genuine sadness as she recounted my personality changes following grandmother's death, describing behavior that she claimed was unprecedented in my previous psychological history. Mother's testimony included specific examples of what she characterized as increasingly erratic behavior, including my sudden suspicion of family members who had always supported me, my demands for detailed financial information about matters I had previously trusted them to handle, and my apparent susceptibility to outside influences that were encouraging me to question people who genuinely cared about my welfare. Her performance was convincing enough that several observers nodded sympathetically, clearly moved by her apparent pain at watching a beloved son's mental deterioration. She described the family trust as a necessary protective measure designed to preserve estate assets during the complex legal and administrative process required for proper settlement. According to her testimony, the trust structure had been recommended by qualified attorneys and financial advisors to ensure compliance with all applicable laws while maximizing the eventual distributions to all beneficiaries. She emphasized that the trust was temporary and that all assets would ultimately be distributed according to grandmother's intentions once legal requirements had been satisfied. Father's testimony supported Mother's narrative while adding the credibility of his professional expertise in financial management and estate administration. He described the technical complexities involved in settling substantial estates, emphasizing the potential legal and tax complications that could arise from improper handling of the distribution process. His explanation of the trust structure sounded reasonable and professionally appropriate, exactly the kind of careful planning that responsible family members would implement to protect everyone's interests. His voice carried genuine emotion as he described his concern about my recent behavior and my apparent inability to understand the necessity of proper estate administration procedures. He characterized my demands for immediate access to estate assets as evidence of impaired judgment that could result in substantial financial losses for all beneficiaries. His testimony suggested that my insistence on questioning family members' management decisions demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of legal requirements and fiduciary responsibilities. Marcus took the witness stand with apparent reluctance, projecting the image of a brother who was heartbroken about testifying against someone he loved but felt obligated to provide honest information about concerning behavior he had personally observed. His testimony included detailed descriptions of conversations we had shared, carefully edited to support claims about my paranoid thinking and irrational suspicions of family members who were trying to help me. He described my relationship with Jordan as a significant factor in my psychological deterioration, suggesting that my partner's professional background in investigation had encouraged me to view normal family interactions through a lens of suspicion and distrust. According to his testimony, Jordan's influence had transformed me from a trusting family member into someone who questioned every decision and interpreted innocent actions as evidence of conspiracy and deception. Marcus's most damaging testimony involved his characterization of our private conversations, including the recorded discussion we had shared during our drive to view autumn foliage. He presented his expressions of concern about my mental state as spontaneous brotherly worry rather than the carefully scripted manipulation that the recordings would later reveal. His apparent emotional pain at describing my deteriorating condition was convincing enough to generate sympathy from observers who had no independent knowledge of our family dynamics. Rebecca's testimony was clinical and detailed, reflecting her professional background in marketing and her analytical approach to problem solving. She described specific instances of what she characterized as poor judgment and erratic decision-making, including my sudden distrust of family members who had always acted in my best interests. Her testimony included references to research she had conducted about psychological disorders that could explain my behavioral changes, suggesting that my symptoms were consistent with stress-related mental health conditions that could impair my ability to make responsible financial decisions. She expressed particular concern about my relationship with Jordan, characterizing my partner as someone whose professional expertise in uncovering deception might predispose them to see problems where none existed. According to her testimony, Jordan's influence had encouraged me to question family relationships and financial arrangements that had previously functioned smoothly and beneficially for everyone involved. Her most persuasive testimony involved her description of my demands for detailed financial documentation, which she characterized as evidence of obsessive thinking and paranoid suspicion that demonstrated my inability to trust people who had proven their dedication to my welfare throughout my entire life. She suggested that my insistence on independent verification of family financial management reflected a fundamental breakdown in my capacity for normal family relationships and reasonable trust. By the time the petitioners completed their case presentation, they had constructed a compelling narrative that portrayed me as a psychologically unstable individual whose grief and outside influences had transformed him into someone incapable of managing substantial financial assets or maintaining normal family relationships. Their testimony was internally consistent and emotionally persuasive, exactly the kind of evidence that typically convinced judges to grant competency petitions in family dispute cases. Lisa Park's cross-examination of each witness was brief and focused, asking specific questions about dates, times, and details that seemed routine but were actually designed to lock in testimony that would later be contradicted by our recorded evidence. She avoided challenging their core claims directly, instead gathering the precise statements and timeframes that would make their lies undeniable once the recordings were played. When Lisa called me to testify in my own defense, I felt the weight of everyone's expectations and the knowledge that my credibility would determine whether the court would believe the evidence we were about to present. My testimony was calm and factual, describing my concerns about the estate management and my reasons for requesting detailed financial documentation. I acknowledged my grief over grandmother's death while clearly articulating my capacity for rational decision-making and my understanding of the legal and financial issues involved in estate settlement. My description of the family trust raised questions about the necessity and appropriateness of the structure my family had created, particularly the broad discretionary powers granted to trustees and the lack of meaningful protections for beneficiaries. I explained my professional background in software development and database management, demonstrating analytical skills that contradicted claims about my inability to understand complex information or make reasonable decisions. Most importantly, I testified about my relationship with Jordan and their professional qualifications as an investigator, establishing their credibility as someone whose expertise would be relevant to evaluating the evidence we were about to present. I described Jordan's initial skepticism about my family's concerns and their methodical approach to documenting the facts rather than accepting any party's claims without independent verification. The moment of revelation arrived when Lisa requested permission to present audio evidence that would provide the court with objective information about the actual circumstances surrounding the estate trust and the family's private discussions about my supposed mental incompetence. Judge Martinez granted the request, and Jordan stood to operate the professional audio equipment they had brought to ensure optimal sound quality for the courtroom. The first recording we played was the private family meeting that I had not been invited to attend, captured through Jordan's surveillance equipment positioned outside my parents' house. The audio quality was crystal clear, allowing everyone in the courtroom to hear my family's actual voices discussing their criminal conspiracy with casual indifference to my welfare or grandmother's intentions. The courtroom fell completely silent as Mother's voice filled the room, expressing frustration about my increasing demands for estate documentation and complaining that my questions were becoming too specific and persistent. Her tone was angry and calculating rather than concerned, revealing that her public expressions of maternal worry had been carefully constructed performances designed to manipulate both me and the legal system. Rebecca's voice followed, reporting on her research into legal strategies for having me declared mentally incompetent without valid medical evidence. Her discussion of criteria used by judges in competency determinations was clinical and strategic, demonstrating that their petition was based on calculated legal tactics rather than genuine concerns about my psychological welfare. Marcus's contributions to the conspiracy were equally damning, as his voice described his efforts to create false evidence of my mental instability through careful documentation of behavior that could be misinterpreted or taken out of context. His casual discussion of manipulating our private conversations to support competency claims revealed the calculated nature of interactions I had interpreted as genuine brotherly concern. Father's reluctant participation in the conspiracy was perhaps most shocking to observers who knew his reputation for professional integrity and ethical business practices. His voice acknowledged discomfort with the deception involved in their scheme while providing technical expertise about financial structures that would allow them to steal and hide estate assets without creating obvious evidence of theft. The recording captured their detailed planning for court testimony, including specific lies they would tell and coordination strategies to ensure their statements would be consistent and believable. Their casual discussion of forged documents and manipulated financial records provided clear evidence of criminal intent that went far beyond simple family disputes about estate management. Most devastating was their acknowledgement that grandmother had specifically intended for me to receive substantial assets and business ownership, combined with their cynical justification for stealing those assets based on their own assessment of my worthiness rather than her documented wishes. Their complete disregard for her intentions and their willingness to dishonor her memory for their financial benefit shocked everyone in the courtroom. As the recordings continued, observers began reacting with visible surprise and disgust at the scope of the conspiracy and the callous nature of my family's planning. Extended family members who had come expecting to witness necessary intervention in a mental health crisis were instead hearing clear evidence of elaborate criminal fraud perpetrated against someone they had known and respected throughout his life. Judge Martinez listened to the entire presentation with professional composure, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking technical questions about the recording equipment and chain of custody procedures that had been followed. Her experience with complex fraud cases allowed her to immediately recognize the legal significance of the evidence and the serious criminal violations it documented. The impact on my family was immediate and devastating. Mother's carefully maintained composure cracked completely as she heard her own voice, revealing the calculated nature of her supposed maternal concern. Father sat in stunned silence, apparently realizing for the first time that their private conversations had been recorded and that their criminal activities were now part of the public record. Marcus and Rebecca looked shocked and defeated, understanding that their testimony had been completely undermined by their own recorded admissions of conspiracy and perjury. Robert Chen requested an immediate recess to confer with his clients, but Judge Martinez denied the request and demanded an explanation for the evidence that had just been presented. Chen's attempts to characterize the recordings as misunderstandings or taken out of context were immediately dismissed by the judge, who clearly recognized criminal admissions when she heard them. Lisa's presentation of the civil evidence was equally compelling, demonstrating that the estate trust had been designed to facilitate theft rather than provide protection, and that my family's management of grandmother's assets had violated both their fiduciary duties and her explicit testamentary instructions. The financial documentation revealed that substantial amounts had already been transferred to accounts controlled exclusively by the trustees, exactly as their recorded conversations had described. Judge Martinez's ruling was swift and comprehensive. She immediately dissolved the estate trust and ordered all assets to be transferred to independent management pending full investigation of potential criminal violations. She found clear and convincing evidence that the competency petition was based on false testimony and fraudulent evidence, dismissing all claims about my mental incapacity and ordering immediate restoration of my full legal rights to the inheritance. More significantly, she ordered that copies of all evidence be provided immediately to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation, noting that the recordings documented multiple felony violations that required prosecutorial review regardless of family relationships or civil settlement preferences. Her ruling made it clear that criminal charges would be pursued aggressively and that plea negotiations would need to account for the serious nature of the offenses and the vulnerability of the intended victim. The criminal investigators who had been waiting outside the courtroom were immediately summoned to take custody of the evidence and begin formal proceedings against all participants in the conspiracy. Mother, father Marcus, and Rebecca were informed that they were subjects of a criminal investigation and advised to retain separate legal counsel since their interests were no longer aligned and each faced potential prison sentences for their individual roles in the conspiracy. The civil recovery process moved quickly once the criminal evidence established the scope of the theft and the fraudulent nature of the trust structure. Independent auditors confirmed that approximately $400,000 in estate assets had been transferred to accounts controlled by my family, while additional amounts had been committed to investments and expenditures that benefited the trustees rather than the legitimate beneficiaries. The emotional impact of the revelations extended far beyond the immediate legal and financial consequences. Extended family members who had witnessed the proceedings were forced to confront the reality that people they had trusted and respected throughout their lives were capable of elaborate criminal deception directed against their own family members. The betrayal of trust and violation of family relationships created lasting damage that extended far beyond the specific victims of the conspiracy. Jordan's support throughout the legal proceedings was invaluable, providing both professional expertise and personal stability during the most challenging period of my life. Their methodical approach to gathering evidence and their understanding of criminal investigation procedures had been essential for exposing the conspiracy and ensuring that justice was served. Their commitment to uncovering the truth had protected not only my immediate interests but also prevented my family from victimizing other potential targets in the future. The final resolution of both criminal and civil proceedings took nearly 2 years to complete, but the outcome provided complete vindication of my competence and full recovery of my stolen inheritance, along with substantial additional damages for the emotional and reputational harm my family had attempted to cause. All 4 conspirators received prison sentences reflecting the serious nature of their crimes and their betrayal of family relationships that should have provided protection rather than exploitation. My relationship with Jordan deepened significantly during this difficult period as we navigated the complex legal and emotional challenges together and built a partnership based on mutual respect, trust, and shared commitment to honesty and justice. Their professional skills and personal integrity had been crucial for protecting my interests and exposing criminal behavior that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of trusting my own perceptions and judgment, even when people I loved were encouraging me to doubt myself. The recordings had revealed that my initial suspicions about the estate management were not only reasonable but actually understated the scope of the criminal activity that was occurring. My willingness to question family members who had always seemed trustworthy had been vindicated completely by the evidence of their elaborate deception. 5 years later, I have rebuilt my life around authentic relationships and transparent communication, using the inheritance grandmother intended for me to establish financial security and pursue personal goals that reflect my actual values and interests, rather than others' expectations or manipulations. The business ownership she bequeathed to me has provided both income and professional satisfaction, while the financial assets have been invested responsibly to ensure long-term security and the ability to support causes and people that matter to me. Jordan and I married 3 years after the criminal convictions, building our relationship on the foundation of trust and mutual respect that had been tested and strengthened during the most challenging period of both our lives. Their continued work in fraud investigation has helped protect other victims from financial crimes, while my own experience has made me an advocate for family members who find themselves targeted by relatives willing to prioritize money over relationships and honesty. The Thompson family accounting practice was eventually sold to a competitor after father's criminal conviction made it impossible to maintain client relationships or professional licensing. The reputation damage extended to all family members, creating lasting consequences that affected their ability to rebuild their lives and careers, even after completing their prison sentences. Mother's real estate career ended permanently as her criminal conviction and the publicity surrounding the case made it impossible to maintain the trust relationships essential for success in that profession. Her ability to manipulate and deceive clients had been exposed publicly, creating liability concerns for any brokerage willing to employ someone with her demonstrated history of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The extended family relationships that had been damaged by the conspiracy have never fully recovered, as relatives and friends found it difficult to trust people who had been willing to engage in such elaborate deception against their own family members. The social and professional consequences of their criminal behavior created lasting isolation that extended far beyond the immediate legal penalties they received. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact has been my understanding that authentic relationships require
honest communication and mutual respect rather than the kind of calculated manipulation and control that had characterized my family's approach to managing relationships and conflicts. The experience taught me to value people who demonstrate integrity and consistency rather than those who claim to act in my best interests while pursuing their own agenda through deception and exploitation. The recordings Jordan captured did more than expose criminal behavior and recover stolen assets. They revealed the difference between genuine love and concern versus manipulative control disguised as family loyalty. That distinction has shaped every relationship and decision I have made since, ensuring that I surround myself with people whose actions match their words and whose support is based on respect for my autonomy rather than attempts to control my choices for their benefit. The autumn morning 10 years after the courtroom revelation dawned crisp and clear over Portland, with the same golden light filtering through maple trees that had once illuminated my family's deception. I stood in the kitchen of the house Jordan and I had purchased in the Hawthorne district, watching my partner prepare coffee while our daughter Emma played quietly in the living room. At 5 years old, she had inherited Jordan's analytical mind and my stubborn determination to understand how things worked, spending her morning building elaborate structures with blocks while explaining her architectural decisions to anyone willing to listen. The house we had chosen was nothing like the Forest Heights colonial where I had grown up, reflecting our shared preference for authentic character over impressive facades. The 1920s craftsman had required extensive renovation, but we had approached each project together, learning carpentry and plumbing and electrical work through trial and error rather than hiring contractors for tasks we could master ourselves. Every improvement reflected our actual preferences rather than someone else's expectations, creating a home that felt genuinely ours in ways I had never experienced before. Jordan's investigation business had evolved into a specialized practice focusing on family financial crimes and elder abuse cases, drawing referrals from attorneys and social workers who had learned to recognize the warning signs of the kind of sophisticated manipulation my own family had employed. Their expertise had helped dozens of families expose and recover from similar betrayals, though none had involved the elaborate planning and psychological manipulation that had characterized my own situation. The success of their practice had validated the decision to specialize in cases that combined financial fraud with emotional manipulation, recognizing that traditional law enforcement often struggled to understand the complex dynamics that allowed family members to steal from their own relatives with minimal risk of detection or prosecution. Jordan's ability to document these crimes through professional surveillance techniques had become increasingly valuable as more victims found the courage to challenge family members who had seemed beyond suspicion. My own career had flourished in ways that would have been impossible under my family's control, as the inheritance grandmother had both financial security and the freedom to pursue professional opportunities based on interest rather than immediate financial necessity. The database development company I had founded 3 years after the criminal convictions now employed 26 people and specialized in creating systems for nonprofit organizations and government agencies that needed sophisticated data management but lacked the resources for expensive commercial solutions. The business had grown organically through referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations rather than aggressive marketing, reflecting the same methodical approach to relationship building that had characterized my investment strategy during the years when my family was dismissing my financial capabilities. Each client engagement was built on transparency and mutual respect rather than the kind of manipulative sales techniques that prioritized short-term profits over long-term partnerships.
Emma's presence in our lives had created unexpected connections to family relationships and traditions that I had thought were permanently damaged by the betrayal and criminal prosecutions. Her curiosity about her grandparents and extended family had forced Jordan and me to develop age-appropriate explanations for the complex history that had shaped our lives before her birth, teaching her about the difference between people who demonstrate love through actions versus those who claim affection while pursuing their own interests. The conversations about family loyalty and trust had been challenging but ultimately valuable, helping Emma understand that authentic relationships require honesty and consistency rather than the blind faith that had made me vulnerable to exploitation. Her questions about why some people chose to hurt their own family members had led to discussions about the importance of recognizing manipulation and maintaining personal boundaries even with people who claimed to care about her welfare. Jordan's parents had embraced their role as Emma's grandparents with enthusiasm and genuine affection, providing the stable intergenerational relationships that would have been impossible with my own family, even if their criminal behavior had never been exposed. Their straightforward communication style and consistent support created the kind of family environment I had always imagined but never actually experienced, demonstrating what healthy family dynamics could look like when built on mutual respect rather than control and manipulation. The financial security provided by grandmother's inheritance had allowed us to make life decisions based on personal values rather than economic pressure, supporting causes and organizations that aligned with our commitment to protecting vulnerable people from financial exploitation. The foundation we had established provided grants to legal aid organizations specializing in elder abuse cases, along with support for educational programs that taught people to recognize and resist financial manipulation. The grant-making process had connected us with researchers and practitioners working to understand and prevent the kind of family-based financial crimes that had nearly destroyed my own life, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about the psychological and legal factors that allowed these crimes to flourish with minimal consequences for perpetrators. The academic research supported by our foundation had documented patterns of behavior and institutional failures that enabled systematic theft from family members who trusted their relatives to act in their best interests. My former family members had each followed different paths after completing their prison sentences, though none had achieved anything approaching the financial security or professional success they had sacrificed in their attempt to steal my inheritance. Mother's real estate career had ended permanently with her criminal conviction, and her attempts to rebuild her life had been hampered by the permanent damage to her reputation and the difficulty of finding employment that didn't require professional licensing or client trust. Father had lost his CPA license and faced permanent prohibition from practicing accounting or providing financial services to the public, eliminating the career that had provided both income and professional identity throughout his adult life. His attempts to find other employment had been limited by his age, his criminal record, and the publicity surrounding the case that had made his name synonymous with financial fraud and family betrayal in the Portland business community. Marcus had struggled with addiction and mental health issues during his incarceration, though he had eventually found work in construction and appeared to be building a stable if modest life focused on sobriety and personal responsibility. His letters to me had evolved from desperate attempts at reconciliation to what seemed like genuine acceptance of responsibility for his choices and their consequences, though I had maintained the boundaries recommended by my therapist and had not pursued renewed contact. Rebecca had relocated to Seattle after her release, apparently seeking opportunities to rebuild her career in a city where her criminal history was less well known to potential employers and professional contacts. Her attempts to re-establish herself in marketing had met with limited success as background checks and internet searches continued to reveal the criminal convictions that made her unemployable in positions requiring client trust or financial responsibility. The extended family relationships that had been damaged by the revelation of the conspiracy had healed slowly and partially, with some relatives maintaining contact despite their discomfort with the criminal prosecutions, while others had chosen to distance themselves from the entire situation rather than navigate the complex emotional and ethical issues involved.
Holiday gatherings and family celebrations had been permanently altered by the absence of the people who had once been central to family traditions and shared memories. The social consequences of their criminal behavior had extended far beyond the immediate family, affecting friendships and professional relationships throughout the Portland community where their reputations had been established over decades of apparently respectable behavior. The contrast between their public personas and their private criminal activities had created lasting questions about the reliability of character assessments and the possibility of truly knowing people who were skilled at maintaining facades while pursuing hidden agendas. Jordan and I had developed a circle of friends and professional colleagues who shared our commitment to honest communication and transparent relationships, creating a social environment where authenticity was valued over impression management and where personal boundaries were respected rather than seen as obstacles to overcome through manipulation. The contrast with my previous family relationships was stark and continuing, demonstrating the difference between genuine intimacy and the kind of emotional control that had characterized my upbringing. Emma's development had been shaped by our commitment to fostering her independence and critical thinking rather than demanding compliance with adult expectations or preferences. Encouraging her to ask questions and form her own opinions while providing the guidance and support necessary for her safety and well-being. Her confidence in expressing her own thoughts and preferences was already evident at 5 years old, suggesting that she would be far less vulnerable to the kind of manipulation that had nearly destroyed my life. The therapy and counseling that had been essential during the legal proceedings had continued intermittently over the years, providing ongoing support for processing the complex emotions associated with family betrayal and helping me develop healthier patterns of trust and boundary setting in all relationships. The professional guidance had been particularly valuable during Emma's infancy when the responsibilities of parenthood had triggered unexpected anxieties about my ability to protect her from potential harm. The financial management skills I had developed during my secret investment years had served me well in managing the inheritance and building long-term security for my family, though the approach I now used was characterized by transparency and collaboration with Jordan rather than the secrecy that had been necessary during my marriage. Our investment decisions were made jointly after thorough discussion and analysis, reflecting our shared values and risk tolerance rather than hidden individual agendas. The business ownership that grandmother had bequeathed to me had been sold shortly after the criminal convictions, as the accounting practice's reputation had been permanently damaged by father's criminal behavior and the publicity surrounding the case. The proceeds from that sale had been invested in diversified holdings that provided steady income without requiring active management or creating potential conflicts of interest with my own business ventures. The legal precedent established by our case had influenced subsequent prosecutions of similar crimes, with prosecutors and judges increasingly recognizing the serious nature of family-based financial fraud and the sophisticated manipulation techniques that were often involved in these cases. The recorded evidence that Jordan had gathered had become a model for documenting complex conspiracy cases, demonstrating the importance of objective evidence in situations where victim credibility might be undermined by claims of mental instability or family conflict. The civil recovery process had established important legal principles about fiduciary duties and the rights of beneficiaries to challenge trust structures that appeared to serve trustee interests rather than beneficiary welfare, creating stronger protections for people who found themselves in similar situations. The damage awards we had received had reflected not only the financial theft but also the emotional harm and reputational damage that had been inflicted through the conspiracy and false competency proceedings. Emma's bedtime stories often featured characters who learned to trust their own judgment despite pressure from others to accept external definitions of reality, reflecting our commitment to teaching her the critical thinking skills that might protect her from manipulation while encouraging her natural curiosity and independence. Her favorite tales involved protagonists who discovered hidden truths through careful observation and persistent investigation, themes that resonated with her own analytical personality and desire to understand how things really worked.
The community of fraud survivors and family crime victims that had emerged around Jordan's practice had provided ongoing support and validation for our own experience, demonstrating that family financial betrayal was more common than most people realized and that recovery was possible with appropriate legal and emotional support. The shared experiences and mutual assistance within this community had helped many people rebuild their lives and relationships after suffering similar violations of trust and family loyalty. The documentary filmmaker who had contacted us 3 years earlier had completed a film about family financial crimes that featured our story alongside several other cases, helping to educate the public about the warning signs and psychological dynamics that enabled these crimes to flourish with minimal detection or consequences. The film had been distributed to legal professionals, social workers, and family counselors who worked with at-risk populations, contributing to improved recognition and prevention of elder abuse and family fraud. Emma's questions about the documentary and her family's history had led to age-appropriate discussions about the importance of actions matching words and the difference between people who demonstrated love through consistent support versus those who claimed affection while pursuing their own interests. Her understanding of these concepts was sophisticated for a 5-year-old, reflecting both her natural intelligence and our commitment to honest communication about complex emotional and ethical issues. The scholarship fund we had established at Portland State University provided support for students studying criminology, social work, and family law with particular interest in financial exploitation and victim advocacy, ensuring that future professionals would be better prepared to recognize and address the sophisticated manipulation techniques that characterized modern family financial crimes. The scholarship recipients often pursued research projects that expanded understanding of these issues, contributing to improved prevention and prosecution strategies. Jordan's expert testimony in similar cases had helped secure convictions and asset recovery for dozens of other victims, demonstrating that our experience had contributed to broader improvements in how the legal system addressed family financial crimes. Their reputation as an investigator who could document complex conspiracy cases had made them a sought-after consultant for attorneys representing victims of sophisticated financial manipulation, though they remained selective about cases that aligned with their expertise and values. The annual conference on family financial crimes that we had helped organize brought together investigators, prosecutors, victim advocates, and researchers from across the country, creating opportunities for professional development and information sharing that improved outcomes for victims and accountability for perpetrators. The conference had become an important forum for discussing emerging trends and developing best practices for prevention and prosecution of these crimes. Emma's 5th birthday party had been celebrated in our backyard with friends from her preschool and their families, creating the kind of joyful family gathering that felt authentic and spontaneous rather than performed for the benefit of observers or designed to maintain particular impressions. The contrast with the elaborate productions that had characterized my childhood celebrations was stark and continuing, reflecting our commitment to prioritizing genuine connection over appearance management. The vegetable garden that Emma and I had planted together that spring had produced an abundant harvest that we shared with neighbors and donated to local food banks, teaching her about the satisfaction of contributing to community welfare while developing practical skills and understanding of how food production connected to environmental stewardship. Her enthusiasm for the garden work had surprised both Jordan and me, suggesting interests and talents that might develop in unexpected directions as she grew older. The financial literacy program we had developed for high school students had been adopted by several school districts, providing young people with practical skills for recognizing and resisting financial manipulation while building healthy money management habits that could protect them throughout their lives. The curriculum emphasized critical thinking and independent verification of financial information rather than blind trust in authority figures or family members who claim to act in their best interests. Emma's natural curiosity about money and numbers had led to informal lessons about saving, spending, and the difference between needs and wants, though we were careful to provide age-appropriate information that fostered healthy relationships with money rather than anxiety or premature responsibility for adult financial concerns. Her piggy bank contributions and her pride in saving for special purchases demonstrated early financial awareness that seemed to reflect natural temperament rather than forced instruction. The meditation and mindfulness practices that had helped me process the trauma of family betrayal had become regular parts of our household routine, providing Emma with tools for emotional regulation and self-awareness that might protect her from manipulation while fostering resilience and confidence in her own perceptions and judgments. Her natural aptitude for these practices suggested that she might be naturally equipped to maintain healthy boundaries and authentic self-expression as she developed. The legal reforms that had been enacted in response to high-profile family financial crime cases like ours had strengthened protections for elderly people and trust beneficiaries while improving training for judges and attorneys who handled competency and estate matters. The changes reflected growing recognition that family relationships could be sources of exploitation rather than protection, requiring more sophisticated legal frameworks and professional awareness to prevent abuse. Emma's relationships with her preschool teachers and classmates demonstrated the social confidence and emotional intelligence that developed when children were raised with consistent honesty and respect for their autonomy, contrasting sharply with the anxiety and people-pleasing behaviors that had characterized my own childhood under parents who prioritized compliance over authentic self-expression. Her ability to form genuine friendships and express her own preferences suggested that she was developing the internal strength that might protect her from manipulation throughout her life. The Foundation's annual report documented the growing impact of our grant-making and advocacy work, with measurable improvements in conviction rates and asset recovery for family financial crime cases in jurisdictions where we had supported training and education programs. The statistical evidence validated our decision to focus resources on systemic improvements rather than individual case assistance, multiplying the impact of grandmother's inheritance in ways that honored her memory while protecting vulnerable people from similar exploitation. As I watched Emma playing in our living room that autumn morning, building elaborate structures while explaining her architectural decisions with the same methodical precision that Jordan brought to their investigations, I felt profound gratitude for the life we had built together despite the betrayal and trauma that had nearly destroyed my faith in family relationships and personal judgment. The inheritance that grandmother had intended to provide security and opportunity had been preserved and multiplied through careful stewardship, creating the foundation for a life characterized by authenticity, transparency, and genuine love, rather than the manipulation and control that had defined my original family relationships. The woman who had raised me to believe that family loyalty required accepting others' definitions of reality and suppressing my own perceptions and judgments would probably not recognize the man I had become, someone who prioritized honest communication and mutual respect over appearance management and emotional manipulation. The transformation had been painful but ultimately liberating, teaching me that authentic relationships required courage and boundaries rather than the compliance and people-pleasing that had made me vulnerable to exploitation. Emma's laughter filled our home as she successfully completed another architectural project, her joy reflecting the security and freedom that came from being raised by people who valued her independence and encouraged her natural curiosity rather than demanding conformity to adult expectations or preferences. Her confidence in expressing her own thoughts and pursuing her own interests demonstrated that the cycle of manipulation and control that had characterized my family for generations had been broken, creating space for healthier patterns of love and support to flourish. The future stretched ahead of us with possibilities that had seemed impossible during the dark months when my family's conspiracy was unfolding and my inheritance seemed lost forever. Emma would grow up understanding that love was demonstrated through actions rather than words, that trust had to be earned through consistency rather than demanded through guilt or obligation, and that her own perceptions and judgments were valuable resources that should be respected and developed rather than suppressed in service of others' agendas. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.